The Lord of Château Noir by Arthur Conan Doyle. It was in the days when the German armies had broken their way across France, and when the shattered forces of the young Republic had been swept away to the north of the Aisne and to the south of the Loire. Three broad streams of armed men had rolled slowly but irresistibly from the Rhine, now meandering to the north, now to the south, dividing, coalescing, but all uniting to form one great lake round Paris. And from this lake there welled out smaller streams, one to the north, one southward to Orleans, and a third westward to Normandy. Many a German trooper saw the sea for the first time, and he rode his horse girth-deep into the waves at deep. Black and bitter were the thoughts of Frenchmen when they saw this wheel of dishonor slashed across the fair face of their country. They had fought, and they had been overborne. That swarming cavalry, those countless footmen, the masterful guns, they had tried and tried to make head against them. In battalions their invaders were not to be beaten, but man to man, or 10 to 10, they were their equals. A brave Frenchman might still make a single German rue the day that he had left his own bank of the Rhine. Thus, unchronicled amid the battles and the sieges, there broke out another war, a war of individuals, with foul murder upon the one side and brutal reprisal on the other. Colonel von Graham, of the 24th Posen Infantry, had suffered severely during this new development. He commanded in the little Norman town of Les Andelys, and his outposts stretched amid the hamlets and farmhouses of the district round. No French force was within 50 miles of him, and yet morning after morning he had to listen to a black report of sentries found dead at their posts, or of foraging parties which had never returned. Then the colonel would go forth in his wrath, and farmsteadings would blaze and villages tremble. But next morning there was still that same dismal tale to be told. Do what he might, he could not shake off his invisible enemies. And yet it should not have been so hard, for from certain signs in common, in the plan, and in the deed, it was certain that all these outrages came from a single source. Colonel von Graham had tried violence, and it had failed. Gold might be more successful. He published it abroad over the countryside that 500 FRS would be paid for information. There was no response. Then 800 FRS. The peasants were incorruptible. Then, goaded on by a murdered corporal, he rose to 1,000, and so bought the soul of François Regine, farm laborer, whose Norman avarice was a stronger passion than his French hatred. "You say that you know who did these crimes?" asked the Prussian colonel, eyeing with loathing the blue-bloused, rat-faced creature before him. "Yes, Colonel. And it was those 1,000 francs, Colonel. Not a sou until your story has been tested. Come, who is it who has murdered my men?" "It is Count Eustace of Château Noir." "You lie," cried the colonel angrily. "A gentleman and a nobleman could not have done such crimes." The peasant shrugged his shoulders. "It is evident to me that you do not know the Count. It is this way, Colonel. What I tell you is the truth, and I am not afraid that you should test it. The Count of Château Noir is a hard man. Even at the best time he was a hard man, but of late he has been terrible. It was his son's death, you know. His son was under Doyle, and he was taken, and then in escaping from Germany he met his death. It was the Count's only child, and indeed we all think that it has driven him mad. With his peasants he follows the German armies. I do not know how many he has killed, but it is he who cut the cross upon the foreheads, for it is the badge of his house." It was true. The murdered sentries had each had a saltire cross slashed across their brows, as by a hunting knife. The colonel bent his stiff back and ran his forefinger over the map which lay upon the table. "The Château Noir is not more than 4 leagues, he said. 3 and a kilometer, Colonel. You know the place. I used to work there." Colonel von Graham rang the bells. "Give this man food and detain him," said he to the sergeant. "Why detain me, Colonel? I can tell you no more." "We shall need you as guide." "As guide, but the Count, if I were to fall into his hands, Colonel." The Prussian commander waved him away. "Send Captain Baumgarten to me at once," said he. The officer who answered the summons was a man of middle age, heavy-jawed, blue-eyed, with a curving yellow mustache, and a brick-red face which turned to an ivory white where his helmet had sheltered it. He was bald, with a shining, tightly stretched scalp, at the back of which, as in a mirror, it was a favorite mess joke of the subalterns to trim their mustaches. As a soldier he was slow, but reliable and brave. The colonel could trust him where a more dashing officer might be in danger. "You will proceed to Château Noir tonight, Captain," said he. "A guide has been provided. You will arrest the Count and bring him back. If there is an attempt at rescue, shoot him at once." "How many men shall I take, Colonel?" "Well, we are surrounded by spies, and our only chance is to pounce upon him before he knows that we are on the way. A large force will attract attention. On the other hand, you must not risk being cut off." "I might march north, Colonel, as if to join General Goban. Then I could turn down this road which I see upon your map and get to Château Noir before they could hear of us. In that case, with 20 men." "Very good, Captain. I hope to see you with your prisoner tomorrow morning." It was a cold December night when Captain Baumgarten marched out of Les Andelys with his 20 prisoners and took the main road to the northwest. 2 miles out he turned suddenly down a narrow, deeply rutted track and made swiftly for his man. A thin, cold rain was falling, swishing among the tall poplar trees and rustling in the fields on either side. The captain walked first with Moser, a veteran sergeant, beside him. The sergeant's wrist was fastened to that of the French peasant, and it had been whispered in his ear that in case of an ambush, the first bullet fired would be through his head. Behind them, the 20 infantrymen plodded along through the darkness with their faces sunk to the rain and their boots squeaking in the soft, wet clay. They knew where they were going and why, and the thought upheld them, for they were bitter at the loss of their comrades. It was a cavalry job, they knew, but the cavalry were all on with the advance, and besides, it was more fitting that the regiment should avenge its own dead men. It was nearly 8 when they left Les Andelys. At 11:30, their guide stopped at a place where 2 high pillars, crowned with some heraldic stonework, flanked a huge iron gate. The wall in which it had been the opening had crumbled away, but the great gate still towered above the brambles and weeds which had overgrown its base. The Prussians made their way round it and advanced stealthily, under the shadow of a tunnel of oak branches, up the long avenue, which was still cumbered by the leaves of last autumn. At the top, they halted and reconnoitered. The black chateau lay in front of them. The moon had shone out between 2 rain clouds and threw the old house into silver and shadow. It was shaped like an 50, with a low arched door in front and lines of small windows like the open ports of a man-of-war. Above was a dark roof, breaking at the corners into little round overhanging turrets, the whole lying silent in the moonshine, with a drift of ragged clouds blackening the heavens behind it. A single light gleamed in one of the lower windows. The captain whispered his orders to his men. Some were to creep to the front door, some to the back. Some were to watch the east, and some the west. He and the sergeant stole on tiptoe to the lighted window. It was a small room into which they looked, very meanly furnished. An elderly man, in the dress of a menial, was reading a tattered paper by the light of a guttering candle. He leaned back in his wooden chair with his feet upon a box, while a bottle of white wine stood with a half-filled tumbler upon a stool beside him. The sergeant thrust his needle gun through the glass, and the man sprang to his feet with a shriek. "Silence for your life. The house is surrounded, and you cannot escape. Come round and open the door, or we will show you no mercy when we come in. For God's sake, don't shoot. I will open it. I will open it." He rushed from the room with his paper still crumpled up in his hand. An instant later, with a groaning of old locks and a rasping of bars, the low door swung open, and the Prussians poured into the stone-flagged passage. "Where is Count Eustace de Château Noir?" "My master, he is out, sir." "Out at this time of night? Your life for a lie." "It is true, sir, he is out." "Where?" "I do not know." "Doing what?" "I cannot tell. No, it is no use your cocking your pistols, sir. You may kill me, but you cannot make me tell you that which I do not know." "Is he often out at this hour?" "Frequently." "And when does he come home?" "Before daybreak." Captain Baumgarten rasped out a German oath. He had had his journey for nothing then. The man's answers were only too likely to be true. It was what he might have expected. But at least he would search the house and make sure. Leaving a picket at the front door and another at the back, the sergeant and he drove the trembling butler in front of them, his shaking candle sending strange, flickering shadows over the old tapestries and the low, oak-crafted ceilings. They searched the whole house, from the huge stone-flagged kitchen below to the dining hall on the second floor, with its gallery for musicians and its paneling black with age, but nowhere was there a living creature. Up above, in an attic, they found Marie, the elderly wife of the butler, but the owner kept no other servants, and of his own presence there was no trace. It was long, however, before Captain Baumgarten had satisfied himself upon the point. It was a difficult house to search. Thin stairs, which only one man could ascend at a time, connected lines of tortuous corridors. The walls were so thick that each room was cut off from its neighbor. Huge fireplaces yawned in each, while the windows were 6 ft deep in the wall. Captain Baumgarten stamped with his feet, tore down curtains, and struck with the pommel of his sword. If there were secret hiding places, he was not fortunate enough to find them. "I have an idea," said he at last, speaking in German to the sergeant. "You will place a guard over this fellow and make sure that he communicates with no one." "Yes, Captain." "And you will place 4 men in ambush at the front and at the back. It is likely enough that about daybreak our bird may return to the nest." "And the others, Captain?" "Let them have their suppers in the kitchen. The fellow will serve you with meat and wine. It is a wild night, and we shall be better here than on the country road." "And yourself, Captain?" "I will take my supper up here in the dining hall. The logs are laid, and we can light the fire. You will call me if there is any alarm. What can you give me for supper, you?" "Alas, monsieur, there was a time when I might have answered, 'What you wish.' But now it is all that we can do to find a bottle of new claret and a cold pullet." "That will do very well. Let a guard go about with him, sergeant, and let him feel the end of a bayonet if he plays us any tricks." Captain Baumgarten was an old campaigner. In the eastern provinces, and before that in Bohemia, he had learned the art of quartering himself upon the enemy. While the butler brought his supper, he occupied himself in making his preparations for a comfortable night. He lit the candelabrum of 10 candles upon the center table. The fire was already burning up, crackling merrily and sending spurts of blue, pungent smoke into the room. The captain walked to the window and looked out. The moon had gone in again, and it was raining heavily. He could hear the deep sough of the wind and see the dark loom of the trees, all swaying in the one direction. It was a sight which gave a zest to his comfortable quarters, and to the cold fowl and the bottle of wine which the butler had brought up for him. He was tired and hungry after his long tramp, so he threw his sword, his helmet, and his revolver belt down upon a chair and fell to eagerly upon his supper. Then, with his glass of wine before him and his cigar between his lips, he tilted his chair back and looked about him. He sat within a small circle of brilliant light which gleamed upon his silver shoulder straps and throughout his terracotta face, his heavy eyebrows, and his yellow mustache. But outside that circle things were vague and shadowy in the old dining hall. 2 sides were oak-paneled, and 2 were hung with faded tapestry, across which huntsmen and dogs and stags were still dimly streaming. Above the fireplace were rows of heraldic shields with the blazonings of the family and of its alliances, the fatal saltire cross breaking out on each of them. 4 paintings of old seigneurs of Château Noir faced the fireplace, all men with hawk noses and bold, high features, so like each other that only the dress could distinguish the crusader from the cavalier of the Fronde. Captain Baumgarten, heavy with his repast, lay back in his chair looking up at them through the clouds of his tobacco smoke, and pondering over the strange chance which had sent him, a man from the Baltic coast, to eat his supper in the ancestral hall of these proud Norman chieftains. But the fire was hot, and the captain's eyes were heavy. His chin sank slowly upon his chest, and the 10 candles gleamed upon the broad, white scalp. Suddenly a slight noise brought him to his feet. For an instant, it seemed to his dazed senses that one of the pictures opposite had walked from its frame. There, beside the table, and almost within arm's length of him, was standing a huge man, silent, motionless, with no sign of life save his fierce glinting eyes. He was black-haired, olive-skinned, with a pointed tuft of black beard, and a great, fierce nose, towards which all his features seemed to run. His cheeks were wrinkled like a last year's apple, but his sweep of shoulder and bony, corded hands told of a strength which was unsapped by age. His arms were folded across his arching chest, and his mouth was set in a fixed smile. "Pray do not trouble yourself to look for your weapons," he said, as the Prussian cast a swift glance at the empty chair in which they had been laid. "You have been, if you will allow me to say so, a little indiscreet to make yourself so much at home in a house every wall of which is honeycombed with secret passages. You will be amused to hear that 40 men were watching you at your supper." "Ah, what then?" Captain Baumgarten had taken a step forward with clenched fists. The Frenchman held up the revolver which he grasped in his right hand, while with the left he hurled the German back into his chair. "Pray keep your seat," said he. "You have no cause to trouble about your men. They have already been provided for. It is astonishing with these stone floors how little one can hear what goes on beneath. You have been relieved of your command, and have now only to think of yourself. May I ask what your name is?" "I am Captain Baumgarten, of the 24th Posen Regiment." "Your French is excellent, though you incline, like most of your countrymen, to turn the P into a B. I have been amused to hear them cry, 'Avez pitié sur moi.' You know, doubtless, who it is who addresses you." "The Count of Château Noir." "Precisely. It would have been a misfortune if you had visited my chateau and I had been unable to have a word with you. I have had to do with many German soldiers, but never with an officer before. I have much to talk to you about." Captain Baumgarten sat still in his chair. Brave as he was, there was something in this man's manner which made his skin creep with apprehension. His eyes glanced to right and to left, but his weapons were gone, and in a struggle he saw that he was but a child to this gigantic adversary. The Count had picked up the claret bottle and held it to the light. "Tut, tut," said he, "and was this the best that Pierre could do for you? I am ashamed to look you in the face, Captain Baumgarten. We must improve upon this." He blew a call upon a whistle which hung from his shooting jacket. The old manservant was in the room in an instant. "Chambre 10 from bin 15, he cried, and a minute later a grey bottle, streaked with cobwebs, was carried in as a nurse bears an infant. The Count filled 2 glasses to the brim. "Drink," said he. "It is the very best in my cellars, and not to be matched between Rouen and Paris. Drink, sir, and be happy. There are cold joints below. There are 2 lobsters, fresh from Honfleur. Will you not venture upon a second and more savory supper?" The German officer shook his head. He drained the glass, however, and his host filled it once more, pressing him to give an order for this or that dainty. "There is nothing in my house which is not at your disposal. You have but to say the word. Well, then, you will allow me to tell you a story while you drink your wine. I have so longed to tell it to some German officer. It is about my son, my only child, Eustace, who was taken and died in escaping. It is a curious little story, and I think that I can promise you that you will never forget it. You must know, then, that my boy was in the artillery, a fine young fellow, Captain Baumgarten, and the pride of his mother. She died within a week of the news of his death reaching us. It was brought by a brother officer who was at his side throughout, and who escaped while my lad died. I want to tell you all that he told me. Eustace was taken at Weissenberg on the 4th of August. The prisoners were broken up into parties and sent back into Germany by different routes. Eustace was taken upon the 5th to a village called Lauterberg, where he met with kindness from the German officer in command. This good colonel had the hungry lad to supper, offered him the best he had, opened a bottle of good wine, as I have tried to do for you, and gave him a cigar from his own case. Might I entreat you to take one from mine? The German again shook his head. His horror of his companion had increased as he sat watching the lips that smiled and the eyes that glared. The colonel, as I say, was good to my boy, but unluckily, the prisoners were moved next day across the Rhine into Ettlingen. They were not equally fortunate there. The officer who guarded them was a ruffian and a villain, Captain Baumgarten. He took a pleasure in humiliating and ill-treating the brave men who had fallen into his power. That night, upon my son answering fiercely back to some taunt of his, he struck him in the eye like this. The crash of the blow rang through the hall. The German's face fell forward, his hand up, and blood oozing through his fingers. The Count settled down in his chair once more. My boy was disfigured by the blow, and this villain made his appearance the object of his jeers. By the way, you look a little comical yourself at the present moment, Captain, and your colonel would certainly say that you had been getting into mischief. To continue, however, my boy's youth and his destitution, for his pockets were empty, moved the pity of a kind-hearted major, and he advanced him 10 Napoleons from his own pocket without security of any kind. Into your hands, Captain Baumgarten, I return these 10 gold pieces, since I cannot learn the name of the lender. I am grateful from my heart for this kindness shown to my boy. The vile tyrant who commanded the escort accompanied the prisoners to Durlac, and from there to Karlsruhe. He heaped every outrage upon my lad, because the spirit of the Château Noirs would not stoop to turn away his wrath by a feigned submission. I, this cowardly villain, whose heart's blood shall yet clot upon this hand, dared to strike my son with his open hand, to kick him, to tear hairs from his mustache, to use him thus, and thus, and thus. The German writhed and struggled. He was helpless in the hands of this huge giant whose blows were raining upon him. When at last, blinded and half senseless, he staggered to his feet, it was only to be hurled back again into the great oaken chair. He sobbed in his impotent anger and shame. My boy was frequently moved to tears by the humiliation of his position, continued the Count. You will understand me when I say that it is a bitter thing to be helpless in the hands of an insolent and remorseless enemy. On arriving at Karlsruhe, however, his face, which had been wounded by the brutality of his guard, was bound up by a young Bavarian subaltern who was touched by his appearance. I regret to see that your eye is bleeding so. Will you permit me to bind it with my silk handkerchief? He leaned forward, but the German dashed his hand aside. I am in your power, you monster, he cried. I can endure your brutalities, but not your hypocrisy. The Count shrugged his shoulders. I am taking things in their order, just as they occurred, said he. I was under vow to tell it to the first German officer with whom I could talk tete-a-tete. Let me see, I had got as far as the young Bavarian at Karlsruhe. I regret extremely that you will not permit me to use such slight skill in surgery as I possess. At Karlsruhe, my lad was shut up in the old caserne, where he remained for a fortnight. The worst pang of his captivity was that some unmannerly curs in the garrison would taunt him with his position as he sat by his window in the evening. That reminds me, Captain, that you are not quite situated upon a bed of roses yourself, are you now? You came to trap a wolf, my man, and now the beast has you down with his fangs in your throat. A family man, too, I should judge, by that well-filled tunic. Well, a widow the more will make little matter, and they do not usually remain widows long. Get back into the chair, you dog. Well, to continue my story, at the end of a fortnight my son and his friend escaped. I need not trouble you with the dangers which they ran, or with the privations which they endured. Suffice it that to disguise themselves they had to take the clothes of 2 peasants, whom they waylaid in a wood. Hiding by day and traveling by night, they had got as far into France as Ramilly, and were within a single mile, Captain, of crossing the German lines when a patrol of Uhlans came right upon them. Ah, it was hard, was it not, when they had come so far and were so near to safety. The Count blew a double call upon his whistle, and 3 hard-faced peasants entered the room. These must represent my Uhlans, said he. Well then, the captain in command, finding that these men were French soldiers in civilian dress within the German lines, proceeded to hang them without trial or ceremony. I think, Jean, that the center beam is the strongest. The unfortunate soldier was dragged from his chair to where a noosed rope had been flung over one of the huge oaken rafters which spanned the room. The cord was slipped over his head, and he felt its harsh grip round his throat. The 3 peasants seized the other end and looked to the Count for his orders. The officer, pale but firm, folded his arms, and stared defiantly at the man who tortured him. "You are now face to face with death, and I perceive from your lips that you are praying. My son was also face to face with death, and he prayed also. It happened that a general officer came up, and he heard the lad praying for his mother, and it moved him so, he being himself a father, that he ordered his uhlans away, and he remained with his aide-de-camp only beside the condemned men. And when he heard all the lad had to tell, that he was the only child of an old family, and that his mother was in failing health, he threw off the rope as I throw off this, and he kissed him on either cheek as I kiss you, and he bade him go as I bid you go, and may every kind wish of that noble general, though it could not stave off the fever which slew my son, descend now upon your head." And so it was that Captain Baumgarten, disfigured, blinded, and bleeding, staggered out into the wind and the rain of that wild December dawn.